morning, everybody. Good morning. Welcome to Tuesday Chapel. Here we go. So glad you all could join us this morning. We have another great time just to get together with one another in this place. I want us never to forget that this is a privilege, right? I know it's hard to think of that sometimes when you read in the email that it's mandatory to come someplace, right? You think that you have to come, but really, as we're together as a body of Christ, it's a privilege that we get to be together. And it's all because of Christ and His sacrifice that this is even possible. I mean, He's the reason why we're here in the first place. No matter what you're studying at Davis College, no matter what you do in your life, Jesus makes it all happen. Amen? So, with that frame of mind, with that mentality, this is kind of an extraordinary event, really, as chapel, where we all get to come together and just praise the name of Jesus together, right? As the body of Christ. How amazing is that? So with that in mind, I want us to just kind of go in prayer. We're just going to go before our God this morning. Father God, thank you so much for this place, for these people, for the opportunities that you give us each and every day to experience your word, to experience your world, to interact with one another. And Lord, I just pray that everything we say and do in this place and everything we say and do after we leave, Father, would be glorifying to you and would lift up your name. Lord, I pray that our worship this morning would be sincere, that it would be sweet, it would be a sweet sound for you. And Lord, that your name would be glorified. I pray that the words that are spoken today would be your words from your word and not our own. And Lord, that it would go forth and transform hearts, transform minds, and that we would learn to experience you in a brand new way. Father God, we ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. And amen. And of course, we have Dr. Blanc with us this morning. He's going to be our speaker for Tuesday Chapel. I'm going to call it Captain's Chapel from now on. That sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Captain's Chapel, that's what we're going to call it. So we've got Dr. Blanc with us this morning, and I invite you to all stand with us as we worship together with our praise.
And Not easy. I didn't do that. To my knowledge. So I told you when I have quiet time or devotions, private time with the Lord, I start jotting it down. I journal it a little bit, whatever comes into my mind. Lots of room in the front. So close. Thanks for coming. So a passage came to my mind this morning. I being in the way, the Lord led me. So to me, I took that as a challenge. Keep walking uprightly, trust God, jump into the current. Don't fight the river's flow. Don't get caught by the brush or the debris. Don't crash on the rocks. Let the current take you safely upstream or downstream. But, I said, what's the context of that? So I went digging back into Genesis. This is Genesis 24. And the verse preceding that said, Blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not forsaken his steadfast love and his faithfulness toward my master. As for me, the servant of Abraham. He had this duty, go find a bride for Abraham's son, right? As for me, the Lord has led me in the way. The old translation, I being in the way, the Lord led me. But he says here in this translation, as for me, the Lord has led me in the way to the house of my master's kinsman. So then I write, God's favor and his reliability are sufficient means to convey me to his appointed destination. That's by that text, right? By the verse. If it was true then, it's true now. Here's the purpose-driven life. Of course, that's Rick Warren. Millions of books sold, right? But the purpose-driven life lived out on a daily basis, I being in the way, the Lord led me. The first reported prayer for guidance in the Bible. That's what it is. Did you know that? First reported prayer for guidance in the Bible. This was Abraham's servant in search for a bride for his master's son. God of my master, sorry, my voice is going to be froggy today. God of my master Abraham, please grant me success today. This was the prayer. Please grant me success today and show steadfast love to my master Abraham. Now, the prayer was answered before he finished speaking. Right? So here he is praying this thing. And chapter 24, verse 15 says, before he had finished speaking, behold, Rebekah in the fulfillment of this. So stepping onto the path, moving full throttle into the unknown is the beginning of the life of complete reliance on God. Has nothing to do with my personal comfort. It's about trusting completely in him. Now, speaking to me, not to you, this is written to me, right? You'll never experience the fullness of God's leading and the realization of his provision if you, Doug, remain on the banks in the realm of the known, saying, well, this is comfortable, this is certain, I'll stay here, there's no risk here. But the servant had no choice in the matter, and neither do true disciples who willingly and devotedly place themselves on the path, or our text today in Matthew 8, in the boat with Jesus. The storms will come, but he is with us. If you can find your place in Matthew 8, and the text we'll look at begins at verse 23. So I want to talk about peace. So we've done, this is like the third of these things, and they've all been one-word titles. We'll see how long we can keep that going. But the idea of peace, just a little bit of background linguistically, or the language in the Greek and the Hebrew, you sort of come to the same place. We like to think of it as inner rest, inner tranquility, something like that, when in fact we could expand the definition, or the understanding at least, a little bit further. Not necessarily freedom from trouble, but everything that makes for a man's or woman's, a person's highest good. So last week we said all things work together for good for them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose. And see, all things are good, all things are comfortable. So whatever is intended to ensure my well-being, that sort of constitutes what peace is. Sure, there's that inner tranquility, what we hope for. Another way of rendering it, everything which will make our mind pure, our will resolute, and our heart glad, even if there's painful circumstances. So, it's in that sense of the love and care of God, which even if our bodies are tortured, can keep a man's heart serene. If you remember Paul and Silas in Acts 16:25, at midnight, and they had their backs, the skin on their backs laid open, and there they were rejoicing, singing praises to God, being joyful. In that sense, they had peace, fulfilling God's purpose in their life. Another way of maybe understanding this is being undisturbed. Undisturbed. Now that's interesting. So I like this picture, and you can find it online somewhere, but it's one of those lighthouse pictures, where you have this typical, beautiful stone kind of lighthouse on a solid foundation, and all around it are these breakers crashing against it in the waves. And if you look closely at the picture, there's a little door at the base of the lighthouse, and there's a guy standing there with all these waves pounded against him, completely undisturbed in the midst of all of that chaos. And that's the idea of peace. Not that we're removed from the chaos, that we're removed from whatever the crisis is at hand, or that we even feel a lack of trepidation or fear in the midst of it. It's the sense that my well-being is being perfectly cared for by God. In that we have peace. Let's go to Matthew 8, as I mentioned a moment ago, and beginning at verse 23. And it says, "Then he," Jesus, "got into the boat, and his disciples followed him." So that's me today, right? Because I'm saying, I want to be the one on the path. I want to be on the path. I being in the way, the Lord led me. I want to be the one in the boat. Right, in the boat. So we just got in and followed him. That's us. It's our lives with Jesus. We got in the boat. There we are. But then it says what? Suddenly, that is without warning, a ferocious storm came up on the lake so that the waves swept over the boat. That's what you get for following Jesus. Right? That's what you get. Follow him into the boat. This is the type of situation you're going to be in. The disciples went and they woke him saying, "Lord, save us. We're going to drown." And he replied, "You of little faith, why are you so afraid?" And then he got up and rebuked the winds and the waves, and it was completely calm. And the men were amazed and asked, "What kind of man is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him." So what do you see in the storm? They saw Jesus asleep. They began to question his care for them. What does verse 25 say? "Lord, save us, we're going to drown," as if he didn't understand this. So one of the things you see, just looking at the text, you find a demand and a conclusion, which is what we do. Our knee-jerk response is to demand something like, "Lord, get me out of this." And then there's a conclusion that's drawn: we're going to drown. Had they drowned yet? No. Right? For example, if you go back to the Old Testament book of Exodus and the 14th chapter and verses 10 and following, and this is the Israelites. They've departed Egypt, and they're going to be pinned between the mountain ranges, and in front of them is the Red Sea, uncrossable to them at this point, so they think. And as Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up. They looked up. This is all sight related, right? Because this is what the disciples saw. They saw, and it says here that the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. And they said to Moses, "Was it because there was no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die?" There's the conclusion. They're just going to get it reversed here. And they start with a conclusion based on what they see. "And what have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone'?" Here's the demand. Here's the demand. "Leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians," and so on. And so much of this has to do with what we see. And what we see causes us to doubt God's care. I have this short article here by Philip Yancey, and he's basically entitled it, "Does God Care?" He brings to the article mention of a youth pastor, and he's basically given incidences of people that were in similar difficult circumstances, and they could have concluded a multiple of things that is concerning God's care or God's lack of care. So he says a youth pastor in Colorado had just learned that his wife and baby daughter were dying of AIDS. You know, how can I talk to my youth group about a loving God? He said, how can I tell them God cares? And then the same week, I heard also from a blind man calling on a public phone, and several months before, he had invited a recovering drug addict into his home as an act of mercy. And he just learned that the recovering addict was molesting his wife under his own roof. And he says, it's like God is punishing me for trying to serve him. All these conclusions that the natural mind would come to. And so Yancey says, I've learned not even to attempt to answer the why questions. Why this or why that? Why did the youth pastor's wife happen to get the one tainted bottle of blood that caused the AIDS and so on? And so why did a tornado hit a town in Oklahoma and skip over another and so on and so on and so on? So he says, one question, however, no longer plagues me as it once did. The question, does God care? You can ask the why question again and again and again, but this question, does God care? He says, I know of only one way to answer the question, does God care? As for me, it's proved decisive. He says this, Jesus is the answer. Jesus never attempted a philosophical answer to the problem of pain, yet he did give an existential answer that is how it affects you in a day-to-day way. In real time, an experience in your life. He says, although I cannot learn from him why a particular bad thing occurs, I can learn how God feels about it. Jesus gives God a face, and that face is streaked with tears. Then he mentions the difference between Old and New Testaments and how this sort of comes to light relative to the question. He says, in the Old Testament, I can find many expressions of doubt and disappointment, whole books like Jeremiah, Habakkuk, Job center on the theme. As I've said, almost half the Psalms have a dark, brooding tone about them. In striking contrast, the New Testament epistles contain little of this type of anguish. The problem of pain has surely not gone away. James, for example, James chapter 1, Romans chapter 5, maybe these passages are familiar to you. Romans chapter 8, the entire book of 1 Peter, and much of Revelation deal with a subject in detail. Nevertheless, nowhere do I find, Yancey says, nowhere do I find the piercing question, does God care? I see nothing resembling the accusation of Psalm 77, has God forgotten to be merciful? The reason for the change, I believe, according to Yancey, is Jesus answered that question for the witnesses who wrote the epistles. In Jesus, God presents a face. Anyone who wonders how God feels about the suffering on this groaning planet need only look at that face. James, Peter, and John, remember those three. James, Peter, and John had followed Jesus long enough for his facial expressions to be permanently etched on their minds by watching Jesus respond to a hemorrhaging woman, a grieving centurion, a widow's dead son, an epileptic boy, an old blind man. They learned how God felt about suffering. By no means did Jesus solve the problem of pain. He healed only a few in one small corner of the globe, but he did provide an answer to the question, does God care? The book of Hebrews, chapter 5, verse 7. Jesus offered up loud cries and tears to the one who would save him from death. But of course, he was not saved from death in Gethsemane and Calvary. We get the idea that Jesus cares and cares tremendously. And a whole bunch of passages, Hebrews chapter 2, Hebrews chapter 4, Hebrews chapter 12, all underscore this. Let me skip over those and just take it to the end of the Bible, to Revelation 21, in the opening 6 verses. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God." Now watch this next phrase, sentence, verse 4. He, that is God, will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There'll be no more death, mourning, crying, or pain, for the old things have passed away. That is, once and for all. He will wipe away every tear. So what if your entire life is one that's characterized by just suffering? Every day, suffer. Every day, difficult circumstances. But somehow, we're to have peace in the midst of that. Somehow, we're supposed to lay hold on this. All things work together for good to them that love God, to them that are the called according to his purpose. Somehow, we're just to embrace that on faith when every day there's frustrations and doubts and fears and the breakers crashing against the lighthouse and a storm that's threatening our life on the boat with Jesus. How are we supposed to respond to that? He'll wipe away every tear from their eyes. That's an interesting expression, right? So let's say every day of your life is full of suffering, and there are just tracks of tears rolling down your face. It says that God cares so much that he divides those tracks of tears into individual drops of tears, as if to say, and the language here gives us the imagery of him blotting each and every tear. That's how much God cares. Imagine the God of the universe caring so much about you, caring so much about your pain, caring so much about the struggles that you have today, that he's saying, in the end, in eternity, it will all be worth it. All the suffering, all the mind-bending perplexities of life, it'll all be worth it when he, out of consideration for each, knowing each and every tear and what pain that represents, blotting every single one. See, all of this will pass away one day. And all of our suffering and all the perplexity and all the things that we can't understand, all the tests and trials of our faith, all of that will converge at this grand moment in eternity and be worth it all. And that's where our peace is. Our peace is not going to become in this turbulent world in which we live. Our peace is not going to come from some sort of psychological a rationalizing of our suffering, some type of wish fulfillment, but it all rests in God. So what drives a lack of peace? And by the way, if you just go back into the text of Romans 8:28, obviously just go back into the text, and what does it say? All creation travails. Right? So Paul is saying, all of this is working together for good. Oh, and by the way, concurrent with the fact that all of this is working together for good is a travailing creation. What does that mean? I could have you just all groan. A real deep groan. And just keep groaning. So at the same time, you're hearing in your ears Everything's just working together for good. Everything is going to consummate for God's ultimate good in eternity. All around you is a constant sea of groaning. And that's creation. Waiting for the revelation of the sons of God. Waiting for the consummation of all things. Only then will all of this make any type of sense. And what do we have in the wake of it all? The face of Jesus. Yancey says we have to agree. So let's identify some helpful points to try to address some of our doubts and fears, much like we find here with these disciples. Lord, save us. We're going to drown. He says, oh, you of little faith. I think one thing that's helpful for us to understand is the interdependent nature. Yes, that's a professor, right? Yes, the interdependent nature between God's sovereignty and his providence, right? So when we talk about God's providence, we're talking about his care, we're talking about his sovereignty, we're talking about his control. The God who never relinquishes control on us, though it can seem that way, never ceases to care for us. But his care is not like the kind of shallow care that sometimes we feel that's all we have to offer is our empathy, our sympathy. But in this sense, the very real fact that he is using this, whatever this is, that's responsible for the tracks of tears to accomplish his best in our lives. So that kind of truth is not always well received by the rational mind. But then who wants to be rational when you're suffering? Right? I mean, that's the last thing. When you're suffering, when you can't figure it out, and somebody comes up and explains it to you. Better just give them a hug. Faith is intended to be displayed in the valley and not on the mountaintop. I don't always read Oswald Chambers. Matter of fact, I don't always read. Period. No, I don't. True confession. I don't always read a lot of devotional books. My wife has a stack of them. She enjoys doing that, and she farms out a lot of the good stuff, in journals. She has her own thing. I do my thing, right? But on this occasion, Oswald Chambers talking about the place of exaltation, and this is based on Mark's Gospel, the 9th chapter, 2nd verse. Jesus took them on a high mountain. Let me just go over that text. So Jesus took them on a high mountain apart by themselves, them being the disciples. So chapter 9, verse 2, after 6 days Jesus took, and I thought, and this didn't occur to me until I was reading that little article by Philip Yancey, right? Because, remember, we said Peter, James, and John? Peter, James, and John, the ones in the New Testament that wrote about suffering the most. And it's interesting here what they saw, the face of Jesus, right? After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him, led them up a high mountain where they were all alone. There he was transfigured before them. Chambers says we all have experienced times of exaltation on the mountain when we have seen things from God's perspective and have wanted to stay there. But God will never allow us to stay there. The true test of our spiritual life is in exhibiting the power to descend the mountain. If we only have the power to go up, something is wrong. Well, it's a wonderful thing to be on the mountain with God, but a person who gets there so that he may later go down and lift up the demon-possessed people in the valley, that's what's significant. We're not made for the mountains, for sunrises, or for the other beautiful attractions in life. Those are simply intended to be moments of inspiration. We are made for the valley and the ordinary things of life, and that is where we have to prove our stamina and strength. Yet our spiritual selfishness always wants repeated moments on the mountain. We feel that we could talk and live like perfect angels if we could only stay on the mountaintop. And those times of exaltation are exceptional and they have their meaning in our life with God, but we must beware to prevent our spiritual selfishness from wanting to make them the only times. We are inclined to think that everything that happens is to be turned into useful teaching, but in actual fact, it is to be turned into something better than teaching, namely character. The mountain is not meant to teach us anything. It is meant to make us something. Faith intended to be displayed in the valley and not on the mountaintop. So here in Matthew's gospel, right, in this passage, the Sea of Galilee encountered storms, and that was just based on where it was. And you could say, in fact, though they're on the sea, they're in the textbook valley due to its location, causing sudden storms to be unpredictable in nature. Jesus is the sterling example, resting his trust in his Father's perfect care. They're asleep on the vessel, but willing to accommodate to his disciples' complete lack of faith. Verse 26, you of little faith, why are you so afraid? I cross-referenced that a bit with Psalms and the 107th Psalm and the 29th. He stilled the storm to a whisper. Interesting how here's Jesus doing the same thing that God is doing in the Old Testament. He stilled the storm to a whisper. The waves of the sea were hushed. I mean, isn't it worth getting on the boat to experience that? Isn't it worth the mind-bending, perplexing problems, the issues of life that pull you to your extremities? And you think, what's wrong? What's wrong? What's wrong? I shouldn't be like this. I shouldn't have to experience life like this. I'm a child of God. Doesn't God care? Why would he allow me to go through all this? When in fact you realize that it is because of this that you are going to be able to see him for who he is. That's the message of the Gospels, isn't it? Let me give you an example from another gospel, Luke chapter 5. Luke chapter 5 and verse 8. So now, Peter and the other disciples, they've been part of this great catch of fish. You remember the account, right? Boat goes out a little ways, boat goes out a long ways, 2 boatloads full of fish, and Peter's just overwhelmed by this. And it says in verse 8 that when Simon Peter saw this, it's a whole interesting study if you just take that word and just run with it through the Gospels and attach that sight to then what happens in terms of the experience of the one who saw. How that dramatically impacted them and affected them. So how is it that our faith is going to grow? How is it that we are going to know God on this incredibly intimate, experiential scale if we don't suffer the mind-perplexing, mind-boggling, chaotic, all these things that we really want to distance ourselves from and just say, well, you know what, I'd rather just have information than experience, Doug. Really. I mean, as far as being... So I'd rather stand on the shore and watch other people get in the boat and go through that, and then I would just know informationally and factually. I'll have that kind of knowledge in life. That's not what God wants, and that's not what you really want by experience. But the problem is to get there experientially with God, you've got to get on that boat. And you've got to feel those waves splashing against you. You've got to see your life in jeopardy. You've got to see everything that you've ever worked for crashing on the rocks. And somehow have the peace to know that God is working purposefully for your good in this. And maybe that's far too self-centered. That God would work purposefully for my good. He ought to be using me to accomplish his good, right? And isn't that what Paul was saying? So somehow in all of this, how selfish of me to want to be delivered from the pain and the agony and the suffering. I don't want the tracks of tears down my face, God. I want everything to be tranquil and perfect and harmonious and make sense to my mind. And he says, listen, I've got another plan for you. It's easy to trust me, given those circumstances. I mean, that's what's evident here. So what did Peter conclude? He saw this. It impacted him experientially. He saw Jesus in a completely different light. And what does he say? Go away from me, Lord. I'm a sinful man. Broken to pieces. His life shattered in a million shards. God said, that's fine. I can take that Peter and use that Peter. It's like Moses. You could go to Acts chapter 7 and here's Moses making this great case to God. PhD, University of Cairo, God. I mean, look at me. I've got wealth. I've got status. I've got access to the throne. Look at me. I'm the guy you want to deliver these Israelites. Send me. Who is a Moses that God sent? And you go to chapter 3, and here's Moses saying, no, not me. No, not me. I'm ill-equipped. My speech is not so good. Use someone else. That's the Moses that God sent. The one who was broken. The one who said, I'm ill-prepared. I'm unqualified. So let's set Matthew's narrative in sequence, for example. This is an interesting little exercise to do in the Gospels. You know, when you don't have homework or something. So, the life of Jesus in and through us, best displayed in the storm. Does Matthew make that case? So let's find some storms here. So there's the storm of being a social outcast. You see that in chapter 8, 1 through 4? There's a leper. Anybody want to be a leper? There's the storm of being a social outcast. The storm of desperation. Chapter 8, 5 through 13. Here's the faith of a centurion. Desperate. Here's the storm of sickness. Verses 14 and 15. Jesus bringing healing. Here's the storm of demonic oppression. Verses 16 and 17. Here's the storm of personal decisions in relation to the demands of discipleship. Will you follow me in this situation? Will you follow me in that situation? All of these storms in life. And then there's our text, the storm of doubts and fear. And then chapter 8, 28 through 37, the storm of rejection. In every case, each one of those individuals saw something. How did they see Jesus? How would their sight of Jesus be transformed? I think in that passage, verse 23, then he got into the boat and his disciples followed him. This is key. This is key. They were in the boat with him. Not that they woke him up, not that he was asleep, but they were in the boat with him. You see, they walked in with a certain set of assumptions about who Jesus is and about what Jesus could do, about what Jesus could do relative to their lives. And they would walk out of that boat with a completely different perception, understanding, experience, knowledge of who Jesus is. Do you want to get in the boat? Do you want to think your life is over? Do you want to come that close to be that desperate to see Jesus in a different way? I start with the assumption that I need to see Jesus in a different way. I start with that assumption because it's too easy for me to default on, I can think my way out of this. If I had resources, I could buy my way out of this. Somehow, I can manipulate the circumstances by the sheer presence of my ingenuity or something, right? And we all think this way. I can somehow manipulate until God pins you in a place where you can manipulate nothing. You just have to sit there in the crucible and take it. And watch those tracks of tears down your face when visions die and you're desperate. But you're desperate in the right place. In the right place. There's nothing wrong with being desperate. Desperation is not like counter-trust or counter-reliance. Hudson Taylor would say, it's not about the pressure. It's about where the pressure drives you. And there's a man that knew trials and desperation and heartache serving God in a distant foreign land. And he says it's not about the pressure so long as the pressure drives you towards him. See, that's what God is trying to do. But he wants to open our eyes. But first we have to be in a place where we can see God at work. Where do we see God at work? When everything is crashing down around us. And we see Jesus step into the situation, the face of God caring and do what no one else can do. So what's a path to peace? What's a path to well-being? He got into the boat. The disciples followed him. Suddenly, a furious storm came up. 5 things. 1, go where disciples go. So there's the word follow. Go where disciples go. Follow imperfectly. Do what disciples do. Fail constantly. Expect what disciples expect. Correction repeatedly. Learn what disciples learn. Trust implicitly. Know what disciples know. Truth incomprehensibly. What would they conclude? That one greater than the storm is in the boat. Now watch this, and we'll finish. The men were amazed, and they asked the question, what kind of man is this? Even the winds and the waves and obey him! Exclamation point. What would you give to be in that situation? Seriously, to be able to see that, to be able to experience that, to have your faith molded, to have that pressure cause you to rely completely on him, where all you have is God. All your resources are gone. There's no affiliates. There's no friends. There's nobody. It's just you and God. And then God does for you what only he can do. What would that do to your faith? Or we can just go on. Or you can get mad at God or bitter at God and go wander off in this direction and that direction. But not if we're convinced that his good is being worked out through us, if we're convinced. But there's the question, and I go over just a few chapters for the answer. Chapter 14 and verse 32, another water occasion, Jesus walking on the water. And again, verse 31, immediately Jesus reached out his hand and he caught him. This is isolating Peter again. You of little faith. That's our nickname, Little Face. It is. You of little faith, why do you doubt? And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. And then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, here's the answer. What manner of man is this? Truly, you are the Son of God. So here's the question. See, all the questions of life, all the big questions of life, reconcile and converge on but one person. Get Jesus right, you get God right. Get Jesus right, you get the church right. Get Jesus right, you get your life as a disciple right. Get him wrong, and it's a mess and a disaster. It's a miserable experience all of your days. it just pays to get Jesus right. Just let him release the reins. Let him have his way with you, come what may. If you're truly here because you're desperate for God, because you want to know him and you want to walk intimately with him, then you've got to be willing to walk where he walks. And here's one that carried a cross through the streets of Jerusalem in shame, and he hung on that cross and died for us, yet accomplishing God's perfect will. Do we want to suffer like that? Are we willing to pay that kind of price to see God's will perfected in us? I hope so. Will it be comfortable? No. Will it be convenient? No. Can you have peace?
Yes.
Let's pray. Lord, you're so good to us because you condescend, you stoop down to our ignorance, because that's what we are. We're just these finite creatures that think we understand so much, when in fact we just don't get it until we follow you on a boat and discover who you really are. Thank you for the hard times, Lord. Thank you for the struggles. There's people in this room just struggling. And that's okay, because one greater than the storm will not move. No storm will move you from our side, and we thank you for that. Lord, just bless us as we continue on through the remainder of the day. Help us just to be radiant testimonies of your grace in our lives. Help us to see the face of Jesus.